here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there. I'm Brian Hyde. Welcome to Nowhere to Hide. And my, how the histrionics continue even after the legislative session is over. It was not a perfect session in the sense that nobody got exactly what they wanted. But there were a few key laws and a few key things that made progress. And frankly, the hardcore left-wingers in Idaho's legacy media are just having a real tough time with it. Now, actually, it isn't even a media member so much that we're going to start out with. We're going to be talking about euphemisms over truth and the love of euphemisms to try to soft pedal things that really sometimes need to be, stated plainly. This is Stephen Birch, who is actually a representative and serves in the Idaho legislature. And you got to love this headline. The real obscenity isn't library porn, it's propaganda. He's right, but not in the way that he thinks. Here's what he says in this op-ed. This is on idahoednews.org. Last month, he says 68 Republican legislators told 1,939,033 Idahoans that they can't read what they want or what they can't read in libraries. Oh, is that what that was about? That's how many of them voted for House Bill 314, which empowers Attorney General Raul Labrador to prosecute and punish every public and private school library for anything on the shelf that he decides is harmful to minors. That's not telling people what they can't read. That's drawing a line and saying there are some materials that ought not be furnished to minors in these libraries. But please continue if you would. And don't think he won't do it. Labrador has already issued over 50 subpoenas to investigate. Look at that, scare quotes. Is he investigating or not? You know, this is supposed to lead us to believe that maybe that's not even real. Investigate child care organizations that accepted federal funding. By the way, this representative doesn't tell us, did they find anything hinky? I think that's why the investigation's going on in the first place. But nevertheless, he says this bill puts the libraries in the crosshairs of another one of his political fishing expeditions. Yeah, we used to call it accountability. But if it's taking away from a particular agenda, in this case, the woke agenda being, surreptitiously provided to children via the library, well, that's just a fishing expedition. But wait, it's only beginning. Make no mistake about it. He says this issue is not about pornography in libraries. It's about using legal intimidation to advance divisive culture wars for political gain and control, especially within the majority party. All right, hold up a second there. Who exactly has been pushing to put this inclusive material into the libraries in the first place? Is this something that the GOP has been doing for the sake of starting divisive culture wars? If the answer is no, then I would ask, who has been trying to put this material, this divisive, disgusting material aimed at children, written for children, into the libraries? That's who's pushing this culture war stuff. And what they're not happy about, and what this representative is unhappy with, is the fact that someone has put their foot down and said no. Now, even though Governor Little vetoed the bill, it will be back next year. And it was there the year before. Now, it failed by the tiniest of margins. In fact, the veto override, it passed, it was vetoed, and the veto override, I believe, failed by a single vote. So, hey, thank goodness there are some people still drawing the line. And as long as those who are pushing smut on kids, they keeps calling it porn, and we're gonna come back to that in a moment. But as long as you're pushing this kind of material on kids, you're going to encounter resistance. You should probably just learn to accept that that's the price of advancing this woke agenda, particularly trying to sexualize kids and to introduce ideas to them that will introduce deviancy into their minds. 2 years ago, this representative says porn, in quotation marks, in libraries wasn't even a problem. I wonder why that was. Library boards staffed by good, honest citizens were doing their job as they always did and continue to do so. No one was afraid to let their kids go to the library. Suddenly, obscene material in libraries is now a crisis of monumental proportions. And it's not for everybody, but for some people it is a crisis of monumental proportions. But he asks a fair question. Why wasn't this a problem just a few years ago? Because people weren't pushing LGBT how-to manuals for kids in the library. Now, here's the real kicker, though. The real obscenity isn't porn, it's propaganda. For example, if one person says the sun revolves around the earth, they are a kook. If 10,000 people say it 1,000,000 times, people may think it's true. After all, look where the sun is in the morning, then at dusk. Who are you going to believe? Some elite astronomy expert or your own eyes? Okay, this is just pure gaslighting, but please continue. In the case of porn in libraries, who are you going to believe? The woke liberal media or those pictures my friend said he found in a library book? Look, anybody with access to social media has seen the kinds of images that we're talking about. They may be cartoons, but they're teaching kids. They're showing kids. This is instruction manuals on how to perform oral sex, how to perform anal sex, how to masturbate, what kind of sex toys. I'm sorry, that's very graphic. But again, it's just pretend. It's just in the minds of what my friend says he thinks he saw. No, this is legitimately off-limits stuff being provided to kids. Of the thousands of people sending emails to legislators, almost none of them personally found real porn in a library. Do they have to do that? I mean, do they have to go to the library and personally check out a book or have their child check it out? Because there were people who testified before the legislature who did exactly that. But again, if you haven't done it personally, I guess you really can't talk about it. They're genuinely outraged by what they're hearing, but most are repeating what others are saying. Perhaps this legislator could take a bit of a lesson there in what he's doing. He says, I know some people have found content in a library book that they sincerely find offensive. However, there's a big difference between pornography found in an adult bookstore and a library book about same-sex marriage. Here we're getting to it. So if it's not hardcore, really ugly pornography, if it's not a book titled Pregnant Dildo Bondage or some, horrifically perverse thing, but it's just about, same-sex sex, why then that's perfectly okay. And listen to the justification. If it's just a library book about same-sex marriage, which is legal, or gender dysphoria, which is real, rather, well, when it all gets labeled as porn, the facts get blurred and the outrage grows way out of proportion. I would actually agree with him in this point. Yes, when you label everything as porn, but again, it's the inappropriateness. He's getting caught up in the semantics of, well, is it porn or isn't it porn? If it is showing sexual organs and showing kids and introducing them to ideas of, hey, here's some fun things you could do with yours, it's probably out of bounds, or it should be. And especially if it's being couched in the idea of, hey, by the way, you don't know if you haven't experimented. You don't know if you're not part of the LGBTQ community. You don't know if you're, having gender dysphoria, or maybe you're really supposed to be a boy or really supposed to be a girl, depending on, what you were born. I mean, it's introducing confusion. It's introducing ideas that take innocence from children. And if it wasn't being targeted towards children, guess what? It wouldn't be an issue. We know there are books in the library that have content that maybe some of us would say that's not my thing. But when they're deliberately aimed at children, specifically written for and targeting children, it's going too far. How hard is that to figure out? If you'd leave the kids out of it, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But because it's being pushed on the kids, and sadly, there are some librarians who are, again, very surreptitiously and quietly, well, yes, we'll make this available no matter what the law says. If that's what you're doing, you are not doing something that is supposed to be tolerated by normal, decent society. Of course, the concepts of normal and decent are quickly being stretched and pushed, to the margins where, we don't want to have anything to do with that, because that would imply that there are some kind of standards, appropriate or inappropriate, maybe even right versus wrong. Laws should be based on fact, he says, not hearsay, rumor, conjecture, anecdote, or innuendo. I support the conservative principle that government is best when it's closest to the people. That's why we have elected local library boards or boards appointed by elected officials. Well, if this is just rumor, hearsay, conjecture, anecdote, or innuendo, then it shouldn't be a problem. But the fact is, it is legitimate. People are finding these books. They are targeting kids. So maybe the legislature was right. He says, well, the legislature just needs to let these librarians do their job. Library boards should be allowed to determine the facts via a local process that solicits documented complaints. See, now we're going to set the bar. Well, if it meets this and this and this, then we can take it seriously. But look, if a parent comes to you and says, why is my child reading a book that's teaching them how to perform oral sex on another person of the same sex? Why would you make that available to my kid? Well, can you document this? Look, if this is the book, this is what my kid had, that's a problem. We don't need to go through some big formal bureaucratic check every box to make sure that that this is actually real. Let's call in a panel of experts and see if it's real. Anyone who claims to have found inappropriate material in the children's section of a library, not just in the children's section, it could be behind the counter, but if kids can access it, that's the problem, should submit a formal signed complaint that specifies date, time, and location of what they personally observed. Citizens, he says, should go on the record, not on social media, to register their grievances. Now, granted, social media can definitely be a source of outrage. Lord knows the cancel culture crowd uses it to their effect. But no, if the people have a complaint, maybe they need to make sure other people know about it, and social media may be a very viable way of getting the word out. He says library boards should welcome this input and be expected to respond to a documented complaint. But again, only if it meets his standard of whatever that documentation, amounts to. And it sounds like he's setting the bar pretty high. Well, that didn't quite meet it, so it doesn't really count. Or, it didn't meet this particular definition of obscenity. Based, again, on books that are actually available, and we have shown the pictures on here, at least the edited pictures, it's not a matter of just this is just someone's imagination. It's legit. And if it's being made available to kids, that's the important part. It shouldn't be happening. Constituents should let their legislators know if a school library has refused to act upon their written complaint so it can be addressed further, and provide a copy of the documentation they submit. He wants everybody to play the bureaucratic game. Push that paper. Fill in this box. File that form. But that doesn't mean every complaint is agreed to and acted upon. Now, he's right. Not everybody will file a complaint that is actually going to meet the definition. But again, it's not a matter of people with grievances are just looking for some reason to lash out at libraries. It's sexually explicit material being made available to kids when it shouldn't have to be, or when it shouldn't be in the first place. And if you keep kids out of the equation, most people will just say, that's not my thing, but they don't care when you're dealing with adults. It's the fact that it's being targeted toward kids. That's the problem. Any decision will ultimately result in someone being dissatisfied, he said. No one individual should expect to have the power to force all of their personal moral standards on every other citizen within their community, and neither should the Idaho legislature. Then why should the LGBT community have the power to force the acceptance of these books and force the acceptance of making them available to kids? Oh, I had this conversation with a member of the legislature actually earlier this week, and that was her big concern. Well, these books are just there to acknowledge that, yes, gay people exist. We know that. But are they targeting kids? Is it being directed toward kids? Because that's the place where we have to draw the line. They'll find out soon enough. They'll be able to make up their own minds. Why are we pushing this on them? Why are you pushing this on them at such an early age? All right. Moving on. Oh, look, the Idaho statesman is in a tizzy. New tone in Idaho legislature is frightening. Do tell. How is it so frightening? Well, the 2023 Idaho legislative session is over. A few very good and very significant things were accomplished. That would mean government spending. But in all, 2023 was a very frightening session during which efforts by Republicans to attack basic rights were incessant. Do you understand what rights are? I'm rhetorically asking this question of the editorial writer. I'm also asking you as the viewer or listener. Do you know what rights are? Rights are what limit government's power over us. Anything else, you can call it a civic right or a civic duty or something like that. But if it increases your obligations to government, it's not a right. It's a government created privilege. And it's very important that we understand the distinction between those two things. The editorial says, these days when the legislature convenes, the question is always, what group are lawmakers going to attack? Group identity politics. They didn't wait very long to bring that out into the open. Which group are you a part of? Are you part of one of the victim groups? Are you part of the oppressor groups? Here's that Marxist dialectic of, the class warfare, and they're just digging right in. Whose rights are they going to try to strip away? Again, if you have a right, it is limiting government power over you. You do not have a right to push smut or to indoctrinate children or anything else that fits your particular political agenda. Rights limit government power. Sadly, this is a concept that is lost on the editorial board at the Idaho Statesman. The live and let live spirit of the West seems dead. More and more the tide has turned against real freedom. I would love to hear their definition of what real freedom is, because if real freedom is teaching kids how to perform oral sex or encouraging kids to mutilate themselves sexually before they reach puberty, maybe you've got a different definition of freedom than most people do. Most of the time, freedom is the freedom to be left alone, assuming that your actions are peaceful. But if you are engaging in actions that are harming another person, yeah, you better expect that you're going to be called on it. Far-right lawmakers, they say, are actively attacking freedom every year, seeking to use prisons, civil court judgments, and other powers of government to remold the culture, to force people to live according to their version of Christian doctrine. Classic projection going on here. Far-left activists are using their power and using their influence to try to capture the levers of government to remold the culture, to make it woke, to force people to live according to their version of secular atheist dogma, or in some cases, just plain old satanic dogma. It's interesting that they're accusing, basically, the people are saying, no, we don't want to be taken along for this ride of forcing them to live under some kind of religious oppression. Doctors who follow the standard of transgender care, a standard of care rather, for transgender minors would face sentences similar to someone who attacks a stranger on the street with a knife. It's unthinkable. Why? And families of transgender Idahoans who already are relying on this care face a terrible choice. You notice they use the word care a lot. But what they're talking about, this is the euphemism that we have to strip away. What they're talking about here is the surgical mutilation or the chemical castration or chemical blocking of puberty that will permanently alter this minor child's development or life or their physical body. Now, after they have reached an age where they can make that kind of decision for themselves, it's on them if they want to make that choice. But people who are helping them and shepherding them and accommodating them or even pushing them into it, and sadly, I'm sorry, medical community, I know your prime directive is supposed to be first do no harm, but this is a big moneymaker. And sadly, I think we have seen the medical community is not above perverse incentives when it comes to making bucks. For instance, ask your primary care provider, did you receive any kind of reimbursement or any kind of incentive bonuses for how many people you persuaded to take the COVID vaccine? You'd be surprised how many of them did. And you'd be surprised how much they were paid in order to do that. So nonetheless, they say withdraw these, the choice that they face is to withdraw care from their children. Again, care, withdraw mutilation from their children, break the law, or flee the state. So we're chasing them out of our community. It's incredibly cruel. No, what's incredibly cruel is pretending that by applying this so-called gender-affirming care that you're actually solving a problem. Look, the statistics on the suicide rates of children with gender dysphoria who undergo that surgical mutilation or who undergo the puberty blocking, their suicide rate is still astronomically high. In other words, the care that you talk about does not take them out of that dark place where they're trying to struggle with their identity. And it's tragic. That's sad. What's even sadder, though, is that there are people who would lie to them in order to affirm and to further that delusion and then to profit off of that delusion. And they act like they're doing them a favor when in fact they're pushing them deeper into a pit that they won't be able to escape from because they've taken permanent steps. Now, of course, they're also upset. Idaho also issued the nation's first restrictions on interstate travel for abortions. Oh boy, yet another bill that's almost certain to be found unconstitutional. The restrictions were taking minors out of state for an abortion without their parents' knowledge or consent. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good standard to me. Now, you know, that doesn't mean that you can't go get an abortion if that's what you want. But for some reason, the idea that they would say this is somehow akin to denying people's rights. Look, I'm a fairly accommodating parent with my kids, but I am not accommodating enough to be okay with someone who is taking them against my wishes or without my knowledge across state lines for something like an abortion. That's too important of a decision. Now, again, once you're not dealing with minors, you're dealing with someone who's actually over the age of 18 who can make decisions, can contract for themselves. It's a different equation. But you guys just have to keep pushing this about the minors, and you act surprised and hurt that someone would push back and say no. The worst instance of that this year was House Bill 71, which takes effect in January, although legal challenges are inevitable. Oh, they just, please, some judge somewhere, some court, please make it all go away. This bill makes all so-called gender-affirming care for transgender children a felony. Our editorial board recommended the legislature ban only surgeries on minor, which do not occur in Idaho anyway. Yes, but we do have the possibility of that happening in the future, which is why this bill was introduced and passed in the first place. That would leave open less invasive, more reversible treatments such as puberty blockers. By the way, you don't reverse those. They skip puberty, they will be stuck. There's a remarkable video out, I saw this in the last couple of days on Twitter, of a transgender individual, a 30-year-old man who looks very feminine, sounds very feminine, and one of the reasons why he's since detransitioned from trying to be a woman, he says, look, I'm stuck like this forever. I'm stuck because we skipped puberty, and they told me, the people who were counseling him said, you got to do this now, because if you go through puberty, you're going to look more and more masculine. Well, he realized at some point that he was making a terrible mistake, but it was too late. And so, he will go through life as, a very pretty man with a very feminine sounding voice, and it's not what he wants. No, that's not something to sit there and rejoice over, like, he got what he deserved. It's heartbreaking, and that's exactly why he shares his story. Please don't let this happen to other people who are going through similar struggles like he was. But they claim in this editorial, the Statesman's editorial board says, a large body of empirical evidence, cherry-picked evidence, and major medical associations, therefore, might makes right, if most of our members agree on this, indicate this kind of therapy, or this kind of what they call gender-affirming care, can significantly reduce depression and the risk of suicide in kids with gender dysphoria. There are other studies that indicate otherwise. So you may think you have consensus here, but the bottom line is that science is still very much under development, and it's very much in question. And the long-term studies, Sweden has about a 30-year study that probably has some of the most comprehensive knowledge about what happens when they undergo those types of surgeries or undergo long-term, efforts to transition, is that the suicide rate still is astronomically higher. What a sad situation. Education, they say, was a bright spot, though. House Bill 24, the Idaho Launch Program, which, by the way, classic crony capitalism. What a benefit to hand state money to some of the governor's favored supporters and favored special interests. Why, that's going to be a game changer. Governor Brad Little's signature bill of the session will allow Idaho high school graduates to get grants of $8,500, enough to fund an associate degree or technical certification at most of Idaho's community colleges, or to get a head start on a 4-year degree with no debt. It doesn't change the fact that's taxpayer money. That's a handout from government. It's a program supported by strong evidence from controlled trial studies. Yes, by more cronies, okay, which show that kids tend to work harder and be more diligent with those possibilities open to them. It will pay Idaho untold dividends decades from now. Oh, I see they're in the fortune-telling business. Pray tell, what are the tea leaves saying at this point? And then there was another year of good investments. There's a euphemistic word for tax and spending. Another year of good spending in Idaho's public education system. Starting teacher pay soon will rise to $47,477, higher than that of any of our neighbors except Washington, and in the top 10 nationally. Overall, the public schools budget rose by about $380 million, a very healthy increase. Would you care to guess what some of the main articles are this week regarding funding in Idaho schools? Well, Idaho schools, some of them have bathrooms that are so bad the students can't even use them, roofs that are caving in. It's terrible. When are they ever going to fund these students correctly? You know what the answer is. The answer is never. It's never going to be enough. 100% of the state budget could be dumped into the government schools, and it's still not going to be enough. But at least, on the one hand, the editorial board at the Idaho Statesman says, well, but it was a good year of investment. They're happy about the spending, and that's, I guess, in keeping with people for whom government is the solution to every problem. Now, they pointed out that Little vetoed House Bill 314. That was the library censorship bill, as they call it, or the Keeping sexually explicit materials out of the hands of minors. The House didn't have the votes to override him. This bill would have imposed a regime of censorship in libraries. It would have allowed parents to collect bounties by sending kids to get books that could violate highly unclear legal standards, according to them. If you actually read the bill, you'd see it was actually quite clear on what was and what was not acceptable, which means libraries would have no ability to predict what could bankrupt them. Actually, they could. If you want to stop putting books out there for kids that are teaching them how to perform sex on their same-sex roommates or classmates, rather, then you'd find that people really wouldn't be that interested in going after the library. It's this indoctrination and trying to teach kids to engage in practices or trying to normalize practices that a majority of people still don't agree with. And that's, again, this is a behavior that we're evaluating, not a person that's being evaluated. Many of these kids would have self-censored to be safe, making available only or many libraries rather would have self-censored to be safe, making available only the narrowest, clearly safe selection of material. Okay, if they're funded with public dollars, I don't have a problem with that. If somebody still wants to get their hands on some book that teaches the intricacies and the joys of this or that aspect of same-sex sexual relations, they can still get it. They can order it to their home. They can find it at a bookstore, I'm sure. But if it's being done with taxpayer dollars and it's being done in the name of indoctrinating children, maybe, just maybe, it's not that great of an idea. Well, the Statesman is pretty upset about this kind of stuff. Several bills aimed at banning drag shows in public, which again used strategic ambiguity to endanger large swaths of the performing arts generally. No, they specifically talked about sexually explicit performances aimed at children or including children in the audience. Failed to gain momentum in the Senate and died, but several versions passed in the House. Now, they say many of these bad ideas did not succeed, but they were near misses, and they're going to come back next year. It's going to take a lot of courage and serious organization to stop them. Idaho needs to revive the live and let live spirit of the West, the spirit of freedom. I think they mean the spirit of licentiousness, to stop its march in the direction of fascism and religious authoritarianism. It's a little bit late, but the religious authoritarianism that we have been experiencing is the woke religion. And frankly, it's acceptable and it's expected that people would say, I don't want to be a part of this. Look, I know I'm beating this drum hard, but if you left kids out of it, it really wouldn't be that big of a problem. Most people would just say, this is not for me. You do what makes you happy. And maybe you could keep the really explicit stuff out of public view because it doesn't really make anybody else's life better, okay? People who tend to identify around a certain preferred sexual practice or whatever, that's not the sum of who they are as a human being. If they choose to make that the sum of who they are, well, that's on them. And it's curious that the folks who do this seem to be so insistent that, everybody else has to affirm this or it doesn't really count. See, the proper thing would be ask to be left alone. Ask just to be left to pursue happiness in whatever way you prefer. If it's peaceful, if it's not aimed at children who are too young to consent to those kinds of things, then most people are going to say, yeah, you do whatever makes you happy. Just, keep your kinks to yourself. But they won't do that. Now, why? That's probably the question that needs to be answered. I don't know the exact answer. I do know that the effort to try to indoctrinate kids is growing stronger all the time, and there's almost a desperation. And I hear the word groomer thrown around a lot. I don't necessarily think it's grooming them, so that pedophiles, have easier access. Though certainly they've got to appreciate the doors that are being opened to them. I think it's about grooming little left-wing activists who don't hold the same values that their parents hold, who reject everything that came before them as superstitious or evil or bad. And this is about reshaping society in the shape of in the form of some left-wing Marxist utopia. So if people are pushing back, it's not so much out of, well, they're just hateful and they're just looking to take everybody's freedom away. It's drawing a line between what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate. And that seems to make some people very, very angry, particularly members of Idaho's legacy media, who have to resort to euphemisms in order to describe what really they can't say in plain language. Because if they did, people would very quickly recognize, hey, that is way over the line. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.